Thank you. Thank you very much. We are here tonight to watch a film that celebrates the life of Dutch garden designer Piet Oudolf and also celebrates the incredible beauty of his painterly planting designs. I like to think of that planting style as naturalism, and I want to give you a short introduction to what it is, where it came from, and what it is trying to achieve. Before I start, you need to know that Oudolf's style isn't always called naturalism. Sometimes it's also called other names. For example, some people call it the New Perennial Movement. This term is used on social media in the United States and England, on blogs and in magazine articles. It was first used in books by Noel Kingsbury that were written about Oudolf's work. Another name you might have heard is prairie style. This name is very popular among European gardeners, mainly because of Cassian Schmidt's work in prairie habitats at Hermannshof, a trial and show garden in Germany. Just a side note, many European gardeners are very drawn to the idea of the North American prairie. The only problem with that is that they call prairie style, what they call prairie style, has very little to do with our prairies. Sometimes the style is called a meadow. Perhaps this name is used because a meadow is a common reference point for the general public for a planting that is in a big field filled with grasses and flowers. I was reminded of how ingrained this idea of a meadow is this morning when I checked an Instagram post I had done last Thursday of an annual meadow at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. Somehow, over the weekend, this post had climbed to 5,000 likes, which I think illustrates that people have a deep love for any kind of flowery field. Another name for Oudolf's planting style is a perennial meadow. This term is sometimes used in the Netherlands. It was made popular by writer and blogger Michael King. He suggested this name because he feared that if we use the term naturalism, people will forget that the gardens we're talking about or looking at is totally unnatural and completely contrived, which of course all gardens are. And finally, Oudolf's style is sometimes called wild gardening. It's a term that has been gaining strength in the last year or so on social media. I believe it means that this style is close to the wildness of nature, which the people who use this term believe is a very good thing. I hope this hasn't been confusing. It's important to realize that although we may have different names for this style, most of the time we are talking about the same thing. So no matter what you call it, what Oudolf does in his planting designs is really a new way to garden. In fact, it is sometimes called revolutionary. I don't usually go that far, but I do think the kind of naturalism we're going to see tonight in this film looks very, very different from typical gardens seen, for example, here in Silver Spring, or in McLean, or Georgetown. So where did this naturalism start? Where did Oudolf get these ideas? As we all know, anything that's new usually is in reaction to something that went before. And so it is with naturalism. It started as a reaction to the English garden style. For over 100 years, English garden style has been hovering over the garden world as the ideal garden to make. It came out of a remarkably fertile period in the early 20th century in England as a reaction to the Victorian era. Its thought leaders were William Robinson and Gertrude Jekyll. And the garden stars were Hidcote with the hedges that made up garden rooms, and Sissinghurst with its romantic floriferousness and fragrance. There are oodles of other gardens in England, of course, but those two remain today as the best surviving examples. The ideas about what a garden should be that came out of this period have dominated the garden world for the rest of the last century, even up until today. So, what is this English ideal? I think it's best described as an exuberant floral display in a border. Its characteristics are 1. The design is all about flowers. 2. Flower borders should always be set against a plain background, like a yew hedge or a garden wall. 3. It should be viewed from the outside, usually from the lawn. It's like looking at a painting on a wall. 4. Plants should be arranged by height. In front should be the shortest plants, in the middle, medium-sized plants, and in the back, tall plants. 5. A flower color is the most important thing, with a preference for pastels. 6. There should be a careful mixing of plant habits, such as mounds next to verticals. An example is a rose next to the spires of delphiniums that we've all seen in English gardens. 7. Plants should be repeated to create harmony and balance. 8. Tasks that had to be done to keep everything perfect were deadheading, which is snipping off a dead flower in case there are some non-gardeners here. Staking, to prevent plants from flopping. Dividing and replanting, to reinvigorate plants. And in the late fall, cut everything back because it looks dead and is untidy. At the same time that this was going on in England, in Germany, a young man named Karl Forster fell in love with perennials and grasses, and he became a plant breeder. His goal was to breed plants that had the maximum beauty, the maximum resilience, and the maximum endurance. We still use some of his plants today. Rudbeckia goldstrum, the black-eyed Susan that's so common in our gardens in this area, and Calamagrostis acutiflora Karl Forster, which is probably where you first heard Karl Forster's name. So Karl Forster, who was apparently quite charismatic and in love with perennials and grasses, spread the word to German gardeners through writing, teaching, lecturing, even during the 2 world wars. Eventually, he began to influence German landscape architecture programs, so that in the middle of the 20th century, landscape architects started to work on urban beautification in Germany. Their goal was to plant public spaces with perennials and grasses that would need the least amount of maintenance and still be beautiful. That led them to start making lists of perennials that were the strongest and simplest to do the job. Over in the Netherlands, this idea caught on that not all perennials are created equal. And it affected a group of 4 Dutch young men in the 1970s and 80s who were interested in plants, gardens, and design. The group included Oudolf. They began spotlighting which perennials were best to use in the garden because the plants had desirable qualities, such as they wouldn't need to be staked. They also began looking to nature for inspiration and began arranging plants more like nature does. They wrote books explaining their new ideas. This was all so different from the English garden ideal. And by the 1990s, Oudolf and another designer from the group, Henk Gerritsen, were asked to design gardens in England. And soon after that, their work was being called the Dutch Wave, which was a pretty big deal because their work and ideas now had a name. Two of the four men died in the early 2000s, and one is now in his 80s. So Oudolf is the only one who has carried the ideas forward to today. So what is this style that they developed? It's a planting style that mixes strong perennials with grasses in an artful way to mimic nature. The tenets of naturalism are: use only perennials and grasses. Bulbs are okay, too, but trees, shrubs, and annuals generally aren't used. Use only sturdy plants, no staking, no deadheading, no plants that collapse after blooming. 3, choose plants with a natural character. Stay as close as possible to the species in the wild. An example that I could think of today is the single hellebores that we used to plant, but now we see only doubles in garden centers. So they would choose the singles rather than the doubles. And 4, remember that the form and structure of the plant are just as important as the flower and color. 5, arrange plants as nature does. Plants should be intermingled. No hierarchy of size in where they are placed in a bed. 6, keep plant skeletons and seed heads up in winter. There is beauty in death. 7, garden with nature. Organically, no pesticides, no chemical fertilizers, only compost. There are other aspects of naturalism that are very important to practitioners like Oudolf. They want garden visitors to have an emotional connection with the planting. They also want the garden to be an immersive experience, to be able to walk through the planting and feel surrounded. The plants are taller, and one almost feels enveloped. They want garden visitors to feel the freedom of an open field, to be taken far from, for example, urban life. I thought of this in the recent super blooms in California, how that everyone responded to that openness of those landscapes. And to get all of the above, the scale of the planted area has to be larger. Everything tends to be planted in. There's a vastness that makes you catch your breath. There is also a subtext that naturalistic planting is lower in environmental impact, is more wildlife friendly, is more ecological. It feels that way, even if that feeling is merely anecdotal. So as you're watching the film about this great plantsman and designer, who is the closest thing to a horticultural superstar the gardening world has ever had, I hope you understand a little better how his planting style has cracked open ideas that many thought were cast in stone. And maybe you will be a little closer to trying out this new idea for yourself. Thank you.